My grandmother used to say that the quietest person in the room is usually the one who knows the most. I never fully understood that until I was sitting in my parents' living room in Sarasota, watching my brother Marcus stand at the head of the dining table like he'd already won something, and realizing that he had no idea, none at all, that everything he thought he was about to inherit had legally belonged to me for 5 years. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I grew up the second child in a family that had very clear opinions about who mattered. Marcus was 4 years older than me, and from the time I was old enough to notice, he occupied a different category of existence in our household. He was the firstborn son. He was the one who got the car on his 16th birthday, the one whose college tuition was paid without discussion, the one whose business ideas were funded with enthusiasm and very few questions asked. When Marcus spoke at the dinner table, our parents leaned in. When I spoke, they nodded politely and looked at their plates. I don't say this with bitterness. I've had years to process it, and what I've arrived at is something closer to clarity than anger. My parents weren't cruel people. They were just people shaped by a certain set of assumptions about how families worked, about who carried the family name forward, about whose ambitions deserved investment, and whose deserved gentle discouragement. My ambitions received the gentle discouragement variety. It showed up in small ways, the kind of small that accumulates into something large over years. When Marcus wanted to play travel baseball at 14, my parents drove 3 hours each weekend without complaint. When I wanted to take a summer architecture program at 16, my mother said it seemed expensive for something I'd probably lose interest in. When Marcus dropped out of his first college major and switched to business, my father called it maturity. When I graduated with a degree in finance and a minor in urban planning, my father said, "Good. Now get a stable job." I got a stable job. I worked at a property management company in Tampa for 3 years, learning the business from the inside, not from the investment side, which was the glamorous part everyone talked about, but from the operational side, which was where the actual knowledge lived. I learned how to read a lease. I learned what deferred maintenance looked like before it became a lawsuit. I learned which tenants would pay late but pay, and which would skip. I learned things that took most investors years of expensive mistakes to figure out. I was taking notes the whole time. When I told my parents at 22 that I wanted to get my real estate license, my mother asked if I'd considered something more stable. When I told them I was taking a second job to save for my first investment property, my father said, "Just don't come to us when it doesn't pan out." When I closed on my first duplex in Tampa at 24, I mentioned it at Thanksgiving, and Marcus spent 20 minutes explaining to everyone at the table why the Tampa rental market was overvalued. He had no particular expertise in this. He was in sales. But he spoke with the confident volume of someone accustomed to being listened to, and everyone at the table nodded along. No one asked to see the property. No one asked about my financing or my tenants or my plan. No one congratulated me.
My grandmother did, though.
My father's mother, Eleanor, who had spent 40 years quietly building one of the most underestimated real estate portfolios in Sarasota County. She called me the next morning. "Tell me about it," she said. "Tell me everything."
So I did.
That phone call lasted 3 hours, and it changed everything. Most of the family treated Eleanor's properties as a given, a comfortable background detail of our family's financial life, like wallpaper you stop seeing. There were 9 rental houses scattered across Sarasota, Bradenton, and the surrounding areas. Some were older homes she'd bought in the 80s for prices that seemed laughable now. Others she'd picked up in the years after 2008, when the market was soft and most people were too scared to move. She managed them herself for decades, drove to them personally when something needed fixing, knew every tenant by name. To Marcus, the properties were future money, an inheritance he'd been mentally spending since his 20s. He talked about them at family dinners with the casual ownership of someone who considers a thing already his. He had plans. He told anyone who'd listen that he was going to professionalize the portfolio, hire a proper management company, maybe sell a few of the older ones and consolidate. He talked about it the way people talk about redecorating a house they're about to move into. Eleanor never corrected him. Not at the table. Not where anyone could hear. But she talked to me. Over the years, our phone calls became a weekly ritual. She walked me through how she'd built the portfolio. She explained her logic on each property. Why she'd kept the Bradenton bungalow even though it barely broke even, why she'd raised rents on the Osprey house by only 2% when she could have raised them 5%, how she thought about tenants as long-term relationships rather than short-term revenue. She talked about what she wished she'd known at my age. She asked sharp questions about my own investments and listened hard to the answers. She was the only person in the family who ever listened hard to my answers. Our conversations ranged far beyond the properties themselves. Eleanor had grown up without money and had built everything she had through decades of patience and precise decision-making. She had strong opinions about leverage, about the difference between income and wealth, about the particular danger of inheriting something you didn't earn because it prevented you from understanding what you actually had. She talked about my father and his brother with a mixture of love and clear-eyed honesty that I found startling at first and then deeply clarifying. She knew exactly who her children were. She had chosen to love them anyway, and separately from that, she had chosen to think carefully about what happened to what she'd built. Money finds its level, she told me once. Put it with someone who understands it, and it grows. Put it with someone who doesn't, and it drains away. It's not complicated. People just don't like what the math tells them about their own children. I asked her what the math told her. She looked at me for a long moment over the phone. I could feel the pause, the weight of it, and said, "You already know." By the time I was 26, Eleanor and I were talking about real estate the way other people talk about something they both love. By the time I was 28, she had started asking me to handle things, small things at first, a contractor recommendation, a tenant dispute she wanted a second opinion on. Then larger things. The lease renewal for the Osprey house. The insurance claim after the storm damage on the Palmetto property. She would tell me what she was thinking and ask what I thought, and then she'd listen, and sometimes she'd follow my recommendation and sometimes she wouldn't, but she always explained her reasoning, and it was always worth hearing. She was, without ever formally saying so, teaching me everything she knew. And then, in the spring of 2019, she asked me to meet her at her attorney's office. I drove down to Sarasota on a Tuesday morning thinking it was about a lease question. I sat across from her estate attorney, a quiet, meticulous man named Gerald Hoffman, and watched as he placed a set of documents on the table. "Eleanor has decided," Gerald said, "that she'd like to establish an irrevocable trust." I looked at her. She looked back at me, completely calm. "I've watched you for a long time, Tegan," she said. "You understand what these properties are. Marcus doesn't. He sees a number. You see everything behind the number." "Grandma, I'm not asking for your opinion," she said gently. "I'm telling you what I've decided." The trust transferred all 9 properties into an irrevocable structure with me as the sole trustee and primary beneficiary, effective immediately. It was structured to become fully operational upon Eleanor's passing or, if she chose, at any point she designated. She chose immediately. As of that Tuesday in April 2019, every rental house in her portfolio legally belonged, through the trust, to me. She kept living in her own home, which was separate from the portfolio. She kept collecting the rents herself for another year, managing the relationships she'd spent decades building. We agreed that there was no reason to announce anything. The family didn't need to know. The tenants didn't need to know. The world didn't need to know. "You weren't hiding," I said to her once, about a year later, trying to understand it. "No," she said. "I was just watching. I wanted to see how long it would take them to ask." They never asked. Eleanor passed away in October of 2022 after a short illness that moved faster than any of us were prepared for. She was 81 years old and sharp as a tack until her final weeks. She left behind a will that distributed her personal assets, her home, her savings, her jewelry, among her children and grandchildren. The will made no mention of the rental properties. As far as the probate process was concerned, she didn't own them. She hadn't owned them since 2019. No one in my family had thought to check. After Eleanor passed, I waited. I want to be precise about what I was doing during those months. I wasn't being theatrical. I wasn't plotting. I was managing 9 rental properties, handling tenant communications, working with Gerald Hoffman on the trust administration, and watching my family make assumptions. Marcus was the loudest. Within 2 weeks of Eleanor's funeral, he was already talking about the properties as his. At the post-service gathering at my parents' house, he cornered my Uncle David and spent 45 minutes explaining his plan to hire a property management company and finally professionalize the whole operation. He mentioned selling the two older Bradenton properties to free up capital for renovations on the others. He talked about refinancing two of the higher-value properties to pull equity and redeploy it. He used the word portfolio repeatedly with easy authority, the way someone uses a word they've recently discovered they enjoy. He talked about it all with the serene certainty of a man who has never once had to confront the gap between what he believes and what is actually true. My parents encouraged him. My mother started referring to the properties as Marcus's inheritance in casual conversation, the way you'd say Marcus's truck or Marcus's apartment. Something settled, something already decided. My father told his friends at the club that Marcus was going to be handling the family real estate. There was a relief in the way they said it, like the question of Eleanor's legacy had resolved itself cleanly and they could stop thinking about it. I sat at dinners and listened and said nothing. I watched Marcus describe to my father the upgrades he planned to make on the Palmetto property, a house he had visited exactly once, years ago, for a family gathering. I watched him tell my cousin Jessica that he was basically already managing everything, which was not true in any sense. I had been managing everything, fielding tenant calls and approving maintenance and reviewing the financials every month, but no one in the room had reason to question it. Marcus never asked me a single question about the properties. Not their condition, not the tenants, not what Eleanor had told me, not any of it. I sometimes wondered, during those months of waiting, whether some edge of doubt ever surfaced in him. But I don't think it did. That was the particular blindness of his position. When you've been told your whole life that you are the one who matters, you don't think to check whether someone quieter has been paying closer attention. The current appraised value of all 9 properties combined, as of the Trust's most recent assessment, was just under $4 million. Combined monthly rental income was slightly above $41,000. Marcus didn't know I had been collecting every dollar of that income since Eleanor passed. He also didn't know about the forensic accounting. In early 2023, about 4 months after Eleanor's death, I asked Gerald to commission a full audit of the property's rental histories going back 5 years. I had a suspicion. Over the previous 2 years, when Eleanor had started letting Marcus handle certain administrative tasks, the rent collection on the Osprey house, the maintenance coordination on the Bradenton properties, she had mentioned to me quietly that some numbers didn't quite add up. She hadn't wanted to confront it. She'd said she'd handle it in her own way. The audit took 8 weeks. The forensic accountant, a woman named Patricia Reyes who had testified in 17 Florida fraud cases, delivered her report in March 2023. Marcus had been skimming rental income from 3 of the properties for 4 years. The total amount, carefully reconstructed from bank records, tenant payment histories, and maintenance invoices that didn't correspond to any actual work, came to $312,000. $312,000. I read the report 3 times. Then I filed it in a folder, put the folder in Gerald's safe, and waited. I waited because I wanted to do this correctly. I wanted every document in place. I wanted the moment to be complete. The moment came in the form of a phone call from my mother in February of this year. "We're having a family meeting," she said, "to discuss Grandma Eleanor's properties and how we're going to handle the estate going forward." "Of course," I said. "I'll be there." I called Gerald that same afternoon. "It's time," I told him. "I need you at the meeting." He said he'd bring Patricia. The meeting was scheduled for a Saturday at 2 in the afternoon at my parents' house in Sarasota. I arrived at 1:30. My mother had set up the dining room like a formal occasion, the good tablecloth, the water pitcher, glasses arranged in a row. My father sat at his usual seat at the head of the table with the particular energy of a man who believes he is about to preside over something important. My Aunt Carol and Uncle David were there, along with my cousin Jessica, who had no particular stake in the properties, but had clearly been invited to fill the room. Marcus sat to my father's right, in the seat that communicated, without words, that he was the main character of the afternoon. He was wearing a blazer. I sat across from him, set my bag on the floor, and poured myself a glass of water. "Glad you could make it," Marcus said, with a particular tone he used when he wanted to communicate that my presence was a courtesy, not a necessity.
Wouldn't miss it, I said.
My mother brought in a tray of coffee and cookies, the kind of thing she did when she wanted an occasion to feel warm and smooth. She settled into her seat. My father cleared his throat. "So," he said, "we all know why we're here. Eleanor's been gone over a year now, and it's time to formalize things. Marcus has been putting together a plan." Marcus nodded and opened a folder he'd brought, printed pages, bullet points, the kind of presentation a person prepares when they want to look organized. "I've been in touch with a property management company," he said, "and they've given me a proposal for taking over the 9 properties. I want to bring them on within 60 days. I've also spoken to a commercial real estate broker about potentially listing the 2 Bradenton houses." "Marcus," I said. He looked up from his papers. "I'm not finished." "I know," I said. "I just have a question." My father looked at me with the expression he used when he thought I was being difficult. "Tegan, let your brother finish." "Dad," I said, and I heard my own voice, completely calm, "you really don't know, do you?" A silence settled over the table. My father's expression shifted. Not understanding yet, but something registering, some signal from the tone of my voice that this wasn't a sibling squabble. Marcus's folder stopped moving. "Know what?" he said. Then louder. "Know what?"
The doorbell rang.
I stood up and walked to the door. Gerald Hoffman was standing on the front step in a gray suit, briefcase in hand. Patricia Reyes stood beside him, carrying a soft leather document case. "Thank you for coming," I said. "Of course," Gerald said. I led them into the dining room. The energy in the room had shifted completely. My Aunt Carol had set down her coffee. Uncle David was sitting very straight. My father's face had gone through several expressions and landed on something uncertain. Marcus was on his feet. "Who are these people?" "This is Gerald Hoffman," I said. "He's the estate attorney who administers the irrevocable trust that has held all 9 of Eleanor's rental properties since April 2019. And this is Patricia Reyes, the forensic accountant who spent 8 weeks auditing those properties' rental histories." The room was completely silent. My mother said, "What trust?" Gerald set his briefcase on the side table and opened it. He removed a bound document and set it on the table. "The Eleanor J. Whitmore Irrevocable Trust, executed April 14, 2019. Tegan Whitmore is named as sole trustee and primary beneficiary. The trust holds all 9 residential rental properties previously owned by Eleanor Whitmore. The transfer was absolute and irrevocable as of the date of execution. Eleanor Whitmore owned no interest in these properties at the time of her death." My father stared at the document like it might change if he looked at it hard enough. Marcus took 2 steps toward the table and picked it up. He flipped through the pages. I had read those pages many times. I knew what he was seeing. The trust instrument itself, 14 pages of precise legal language. The schedule of properties, all 9 addresses listed in clean type. The signature page, Eleanor's careful cursive alongside the notary seal, dated April 14, 2019. His jaw was working, but no sound came out. He reached the property schedule.
He stopped on it.
I watched something move across his face. Recognition, calculation, the beginning of understanding, and then I watched it become something else. Something closer to disbelief. Not disbelief in the document, but disbelief that this was happening. That this particular morning, which he had walked into with absolute confidence, had become this. "This isn't," he stopped. Started again. "This can't be legal." "It's valid," Gerald said, with the measured patience of someone who has anticipated every response. "Unambiguously. I've had it reviewed by 2 independent attorneys since its execution. The trust is properly constituted under Florida law. The quitclaim deeds for each individual property were filed with the county recorder in 2019. They are a matter of public record, searchable by anyone with a computer. The trust's existence and terms have been unchanged since April 14, 2019. "She was old," Marcus said. "She might not have, someone might have." "She was 76 when she executed the trust," Gerald said. "Her physician provided a contemporaneous letter confirming full cognitive capacity, which we have on file precisely because this kind of challenge can arise." Eleanor anticipated it. That landed in the room. My Aunt Carol made a small, involuntary sound. My Uncle David put his hand over his mouth. My mother was completely still. Marcus set the document down. His face had gone a color I'd never seen on it before. Not red, not pale, but something drained and mottled. The face of a person whose body is receiving information faster than their mind can process it. "You knew," he said to me. "You've known this whole time." "Since 2019, I said. "Yes." "And you just what? You sat there? At dinners? At the funeral? You let us." He stopped again. His voice had risen, and he was making an effort to pull it back down. "You let us plan. You never asked," I said simply. "Not once. Not about the properties, not about what Grandma had planned, not about any of it. You assumed. And I let you." "Tegan." My father's voice. Low, shaken in a way I had very rarely heard. "Did you know about this? Did you know this whole time that your grandmother had done this?" "Yes," I said. "I was there when she signed it." My mother pressed her hand over her mouth. "There's more," I said. I looked at Patricia. Patricia Reyes opened her document case and removed a bound report, 42 pages, tabbed and indexed, with a gray cover bearing the name of her firm and the date. She set it on the table with the quiet efficiency of someone who has done this many times before and knows that the document speaks louder than any introduction. Between January 2019 and December 2022, rental income from 3 properties, the Osprey House, the Bradenton Bungalow on Manatee Avenue, and the rental on 14th Street in Palmetto, was systematically diverted from the intended accounts. The total amount, after reconstruction from primary bank records, tenant payment histories, and maintenance documentation, comes to $312,400. She turned the report to the first tab. The page was a clean summary table, each property listed in the left column, the years across the top, the numbers filling the grid with the cold neutrality of math. A column labeled expected, a column labeled received, a column labeled discrepancy. The discrepancy column was red. "The methodology is detailed in Section 2, she continued, but in summary, rental payments from tenants were received in full. A portion, varying between 18 and 34% per transaction, depending on the month, was deposited into a personal account rather than the designated property management account. That personal account is registered to Marcus David Whitmore." She said the name the way people say names in reports, without emphasis, without editorializing, just the name, attached to the account, attached to the money. My Uncle David made a sound that wasn't quite a word. My Aunt Carol stood up, so fast her chair scraped back across the hardwood, and she reached for the table edge like she needed something to hold. Marcus didn't move. He was staring at the report with the expression of a person watching something they cannot stop from happening. The expression of someone who has had a contingency plan for many things, but not for this. $300,000, my father said. His voice was quiet in a way that was worse than loud would have been. He wasn't speaking to anyone in particular. He was saying the number the way you say something you're trying to make real. "Marcus." "Dad," Marcus started. $300,000. It wasn't, I was going to, there were expenses, there were things she never tracked, the maintenance was always. "The expenses are documented in Section 4, Patricia said. Her tone was the same, flat, factual, patient. "We cross-referenced every maintenance invoice submitted during this period against contractor records, county permit filings, and direct verification with the contractors named on the invoices. Of the 67 maintenance claims submitted over 4 years, 11 correspond to actual work performed and properly documented. The remaining 56 claims, totaling approximately $89,000, have no corresponding work records, no permits, no contractor verification. 3 of the contractors named on those invoices confirmed to us in writing that they performed no work on these properties during the relevant periods." The room was completely quiet except for the sound of my Aunt Carol's chair being pulled slowly back toward the table as she sat back down, her face white. Marcus sat down. He sat down the way a building comes down in a controlled demolition, all at once, without drama, because the structure that was holding him up had been removed. I had imagined this moment for months. I had imagined that I might feel triumphant, or relieved, or vindicated in some sharp and satisfying way. What I actually felt, sitting in that dining room watching my brother try to locate an explanation that didn't exist, was something quieter. Something closer to the feeling of watching a long equation finally balance. "What happens now?" my mother asked. She was looking at me, not at Marcus. That was new. "That depends on several things," I said. "The properties are mine. They have been mine for 5 years. That doesn't change. What happens with the financial discrepancies is a separate matter. Patricia's report has been prepared to evidentiary standards." Marcus looked up at me. For the first time in my life, I saw something in his face that I'd never seen directed at me before. Not anger, not contempt. Something raw and unguarded and frightened.
"Tegan," he said.
"We're family." "Yes," I said. "We are." "You can't." "I haven't decided anything yet," I said. "That's actually true. I haven't walked in here with a decision made. I walked in here with the truth. What happens with the truth is partly up to you." Gerald cleared his throat. "I do want to note," he said carefully, "that Patricia's report, as prepared, constitutes sufficient grounds for a referral to the Sarasota County State Attorney's Office. That's not a decision I'm making or Tegan is making today. It's simply accurate." My father put his face in his hands. The meeting ended without resolution in any formal sense. Marcus left before anyone else, walking out the back door with his blazer still on, getting into his car, and driving away without saying goodbye to anyone. My parents sat at the table for a long time after Gerald and Patricia left, not saying much. My mother cried. Not for Marcus, or not only for Marcus, but in the way people cry when a version of their life that they believed in turns out to have been something different. My father was very still and very quiet, which, for him, meant something more than words would have. I stayed for 2 hours. I answered their questions honestly. Yes, Eleanor had chosen me deliberately and intentionally. Yes, she had known exactly what she was doing. Yes, I had been managing the properties since she passed, and yes, they were in good shape, better shape by most metrics than they'd been in years. The tenants were stable. The maintenance was current. The finances were clean. At one point my father looked at me and said, "Why didn't you tell us?" I thought about the right way to answer that. Because I wanted to understand something first, I finally said, I wanted to understand whether if I showed up with something real, something built, something proven, it would matter. Or whether it would still be Marcus's, just by default. My father didn't answer for a long time. Then he said, "I think I've been unfair to you." It was not a large statement. It was not an apology that covered everything. But my father was a man who did not often say anything that cost him something, and that sentence had cost him something, and I recognized it for what it was. "I know," I said. And I left it there. 6 months later. The criminal referral was filed in March, not by me directly, but by Patricia Reyes in her capacity as a forensic accountant who had identified what she was legally obligated to report. Marcus retained a defense attorney. The process was proceeding through the system with the slow certainty of things that have been properly documented. Marcus and I had not spoken since the meeting. I didn't know if we would. I held that question loosely, without urgency. There were things that might need to be repaired between us someday and things that might not be reparable, and I had stopped trying to decide in advance which was which. The 9 properties were, as they had been since 2019, mine. I had brought on a property manager in January, not because I couldn't handle them myself, but because my own investment portfolio had grown to the point where I needed to be selective about my time. The combined value of the 9 properties had been appraised at just over $4.3 million. Monthly rental income was running at $43,000. My parents had come around in ways I hadn't expected, and in ways I had. My mother called more than she used to. My father had, in the way of people who communicate sideways rather than directly, started asking my opinion on financial decisions that previously would have been Marcus's domain. It wasn't transformation. It was adjustment. I accepted it as what it was. At Eleanor's grave, on what would have been her 83rd birthday, I sat for a while in the quiet of the Sarasota cemetery and thought about what she had said to me in Gerald's office on that Tuesday in April 2019, when she told me what she decided. The quietest person in the room is usually the one who knows the most. I had thought, at 26, that she was talking about herself. About her own long years of watching the family move around her like she was scenery, underestimating the woman who had quietly built $4 million worth of real estate while everyone at the dinner table talked about other things.
But she was talking about me.
She had seen it before I had. She had seen the way I watched and listened and said nothing, and she had recognized in it not weakness, but a kind of patience that most people mistake for passivity, right up until the moment it isn't. I laid flowers on her grave, white roses, because she'd always preferred them over anything showier, and sat for a while longer in the Florida afternoon with the warm air moving through the trees. I had built my own portfolio to 11 properties by then, separate from Eleanor's, separate from the trust. 11 properties I had found and evaluated and acquired on my own, through the years of early mornings and second jobs and savings and the particular stubbornness of someone who had been told often enough that something was beyond them that they'd stopped listening. Total value: approximately $2.1 million. I was 31 years old. I drove home with the windows down, taking the long way through the old parts of Sarasota that Eleanor had loved, past the neighborhoods she'd watched change over 4 decades, past houses that looked exactly like the ones in my portfolio, and I thought about what she'd told me once when I'd asked her the most important thing she'd ever learned about building wealth quietly, without announcement, without the family's attention or approval. "Just keep going," she'd said. "The numbers speak eventually. You don't have to." The numbers had spoken. I kept going,